Well now, let's get started defining the actual behaviors that are going to be attached to our player's inputs. Now the place that we're going to do that is inside the PC hovercraft blueprint. And we're actually not quite ready to define inputs quite yet. First, I want to be able to make sure that the behaviors that occur when our inputs are used are actually visible. The way we're going to do that is by adding a few components um, to our hovercraft blueprint. So we're going to go back to the viewport from the event graph, and here in the components listing, we're going to add a new component. Now the most simple way of handling this next part is to simply add a camera. The camera, of course, is going to be what our players are going to use to view the world while they are possessing this particular pawn. So we add the camera, and it should, by default, if you have the body selected when you add component, the camera should be parented to the body. The body should be the parent, the camera is the child, and what that would mean is that as the body moves around, the camera will follow it the exact same distance. Now, I'm actually not going to use this implementation, even though I am lazy and I do enjoy using the simplest implementation of a given solution. The reason I'm not going to do that is because you end up with some ungame-like behaviors if your camera is just kind of attached rigidly, offset by a set amount, and not it doesn't have any behaviors defined to it. Fortunately, those behaviors are extremely easy to access in Unreal Engine by adding a separate component in between the body and the camera, and that separate component is called a spring arm. The spring arm behaves exactly the way that you would expect. You create a spring arm that is childed to the mesh that you want it to focus on, and the spring arm in the viewport looks just like a red line. Now the spring arm source or origin is going to be at the 0, 0, 0 mark on this grid, which is kind of inside the mesh, and that's going to be the focal point of the camera that we're going to attach to the other end of the spring arm. That's perfect. We don't need to do anything about that. That's going to be the target of the spring arm. So this red line is the spring arm. The target is going to be this end here on the right, and the socket is going to be this here on the left, that end over there. So let's we're going to change the default location of the socket, because we kind of want our camera to be kind of in this space up above it, looking down, sort of almost an isometric view, behind the actual mesh. So to get this end up to where we want it to be, we're going to make sure that we have the spring arm selected, and then over here we're going to take a look where it says camera. We're going to take a look at the socket offset. As we change these values, this is a three-dimensional what am I looking for? Three-dimensional coordinates right here. As we change these values, we're going to see this end of this red line move. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that it is up above the mesh. So let's change this to 300. Oh, that is way too high. Let's change that back down to about 100. That looks about right. Let me go ahead and just kind of park this this one right here behind it. Yeah, that looks like that'll do. I'm a little bit higher than it would be in the game. That's about the angle, but a little bit closer. Yeah, that'll work. And actually, that's pretty much all that we have to do. We don't have to actually move it to the left or right, or forward or back. It looks pretty good just like it is. So now that we have the spring arm, now we're going to child a camera to the spring arm. So we're going to select the spring arm, add a component, and we're going to set camera right there. And now, look, even though we had spring arm selected, the camera childed. It is parallel with the spring arm, so it's childed to the body. We want to change that. You can see that it came up right here. Let's left click it and drag it onto the spring arm. And now you see the camera moved, and it moved to exactly where the socket end of the spring arm is. If we click the spring arm, we can see, yep, that is exactly where it wants to be. Now, if we click this camera, you can see that that red line is parallel. It is exactly parallel with the origin plane, the XY plane in this viewport. We don't like that. We want this to point down towards the device, or towards the mesh. And the best way that we can do that is actually just right up here, just like in the world viewport. We're going to click the rotate tool, and then we're going to grab the axis in which we want to rotate. In this case, it's green. It's the y-axis, and we're going to rotate it manually until it looks like it's aimed about where we want it to be. That looks pretty good, and the reason that I think that looks pretty good is because it seems to be pointing at the front of our mesh. That's pretty much exactly what we want. So we're going to compile and save. Now, when we press the play button, we're still set to use our PC hovercraft pawn, and when we do, it's going to we're going to be able to actually see our pawn out in front of us, because we're going to automatically possess the camera that we added. Play, and there we go. So now we see our mesh right there. This is the perspective that the game is going to be played from, and that looks pretty good to me. All right. So that step is done. Now let's take a look at some inputs. All right. The first one is going to be easiest. We're going to do input action jump. Oh, actually, I apologize. I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let's go back to the viewport really quickly and click on this mesh. Now, the mesh itself, actually I apologize. Let's see. The best place that we can do this, yes. Under the mesh, we're going to click simulate, or under physics, we're going to click simulate physics, because we want this to kind of react in a realistic way to the world around it. Now we also are going to override its mass for the ease of handling the physics calculations, if we wanted to have precise control over the physics of this object. Now it automatically populated this value, 35.719131, and the reason it did that is because it took an average density value that's defined by default and multiplied it by the volume of this mesh, which is pretty cool. But we're going to actually change this up to 100. The reason we're going to do that is because that will allow us to easily calculate the forces that we need to add or take away from this mesh to move it in a controlled way. If we wanted to, we could constrain it to only move in certain axes, but we're not going to do that. All right, so compile and save. Let's test to make sure our physics is working. Yep, when we hit play, now we drop to the ground. Now here's our first unintended feature, and that is that when it hits the ground, our camera on the end of the spring arm seems to be intersecting with the floor. And as it intersects with the floor, the camera is being drawn up to the front. That's the normal behavior for spring arms. Like if you come up against a wall, it's going to just press up against the wall. It won't go through it. And I think that the reason that's happening is because our hovercraft mesh is actually sinking into the floor. So the way that we can fix that is by going to our spring arm and changing the target offset to z value of 10. 10 might not be enough, but the idea is that we're bringing the z value up so that it doesn't intersect with the floor when the mesh falls on the ground. Oh, I skipped a step. We need to compile and save. Now we hit play. And see, it temporarily did it, but it didn't stay that way. We still don't like it temporarily doing that, so let's change that maybe to a 20. Now, Unreal units by default are centimeters. So when we're talking about 20 units, that is 20 centimeters. It's not very high. So we haven't changed it much, just a little bit. And now the camera doesn't get all wonky when it hits the ground. Perfect. So, feature corrected. So let's take a quick look here. Now we can go to our event graph, finally. And we can add some behavior when we hit jump. Alright, so what do we want to do when our player presses the jump key? Well, we want the vehicle to launch into the air. Now, the best way to handle that is to add a physics impulse. That is an instant of acceleration in a particular direction. So when the user hits jump, we need to add a physics impulse to the body of this vehicle, and in the up direction. So that would be, for those that are not familiar with 3D orientation or navigation through a 3D coordinate system, you have three axes, X, Y, and Z. In Unreal Engine's case, the x-axis is forward. In local space, the x-axis is always forward. The y-axis points to the right, and the z-axis points up. And when I say points up, forward, to the right, and up, what I mean is that x positive values, as you go along the x-axis in this direction, the x value increases. And as you go to the left, the value decreases. And here at this point at the origin, the value is 0. So you have negative values, so negative 10, negative 5, 0, 5, 10, etc. And then we go to the y-axis, and it's the same thing, negative 10, negative 5, 0, 5, 10. And then the z-axis, which is, we don't have the little markings for, but it would be negative 10, negative 5, 0, 5, 10, etc. So what we are going to do is we are going to take a reference to this component, the body component, and we are going to add an impulse that is positive in the z direction, a positive impulse in the z direction. It's that easy. So when we press the input action jump, we're going to drag an arrow off of the pressed output, and we are going to type add impulse. And it'll even give us our options right here. Under physics, this is a physics function to add an impulse. We're going to look at, we can add angular impulse, that would be a jerk of rotation. Add impulse at a particular location. If you had a skeletal mesh and you wanted to add an impulse like to just its arm, to make its arm fly back or something like that, you can do it that way. We're going to add an impulse. Add to body, just a basic impulse to the body. Now I clicked the one that had the body as a parameter, and it automatically created this body node for me. I don't need it to do that automatically. And just to kind of show you how it would be done if you did not select that one, this is the basic add impulse node. If I want to, so the target input of the add impulse node is going to be the thing that we're adding the impulse to. In this case, the body. So I'm going to go over here to the body component. I'm going to drag that into the event graph, and I get my reference to my body component. So then I'm going to take the output of the body node and plug it into the input of the add impulse node under target. And that means that when this happens, when this node executes, it's going to add an impulse to the body. Now, if you remember, I was talking about adding an impulse to the z-axis, right? And so what I'm going to need to do here, this is the impulse input, and it tells you with a tooltip. It's the magnitude and direction of the impulse to apply. And I'm saying we need it to be positive in the z-axis, as that will make our guy go up. So let's put in a value here. I'm going to put in a pretty high value. Let's do 10,000. So if you remember, our mass is 100. This is an impulse of 10,000. This is a pretty decent sized impulse. Now you can also select, if you want this impulse to change the velocity of your body, instead of being a physics-based calculation that's going to that's going to resist the impulse based on the mass of the body that you're moving. I guess this is the way to do it physically. If you didn't want it to be physical, if you wanted just to change the velocity regardless of the mass, you would select velocity change check, and then it will not take the target's physical mass into effect. It'll just change the velocity regardless of how big the object is. So it's kind of like using the force. Doesn't matter what size it is. If you believe it'll make it happen, you click that button. That's how you make it happen. In this case, I do want it to be a physical force, because I want, if say another hovercraft is on top of you, I want you to be able to jump less than you could if you didn't have a hovercraft literally right on top of you. If I did a velocity change, then you could have the whole universe sitting on top of it, and you click the jump button and it would jump up the same. Alright, so I'm going to compile and save. Now when I hit play, if I left click, I should jump. Ooh, that is a tiny little hop, huh? Working, but hardly. So let's go back to our hovercraft, and let's add maybe just 1 0 here. 10 times that seems like that would be about right. Let's try it. Ooh, I paused it. Let's try that. Ooh, that's way too much. Oh, but you see we are getting some actual physical reaction there. If you saw the, for some reason it decided to turn. Now, yeah, let me fine-tune that just one more time here. Go to my hovercraft blueprint, and then we're going to change this 10 here into a 5. Perfect. So it's going to be half the force that I was applying that last time. Boom. That looks like a pretty pretty reasonable jump. Now you'll notice I'm clicking the jump button multiple times, and I can just continue jumping ad infinitum. So we're going to need to add some logic to determine whether or not our hovercraft is up in the air or not. But for now, this is working pretty well, given the amount of work that we put into it. Ooh, that's fun. Alright. So that's a good place to hold off for now. So the basic input action for jumping is in. On the next video, I'm going to refine the jump so that you can only do it when you are not already in the air.